Welcome back to After Action. I'm Chad Hammer. Today, you'll meet Supervisory Special Agent Dan Arp. Dan has served in Fiji, Baghdad, Kathmandu, Karachi, Tucson, and with mobile security deployments. Dan joined DS 14 years ago and brought a wealth of law enforcement experience with him when he joined. Today, however, you'll hear about a time when he and his team tackled a problem much larger than most law enforcement officers will ever have to face. Welcome to the program, Dan.
Thanks for having me, Chad. Great to see you again. Our paths have crossed many times over the last 14 years.
Indeed. So Dan, set the scene for us a little bit. Where were you in your career and where were you geographically?
So it was my first overseas assignment as an ARSO, and I was assigned to Kathmandu, Nepal. Great first post for an ARSO, great place to learn. Excellent local staff, hardworking, loyal, and it has a right mix for a first ARSO. You know, it's a high crime post, but medium threat for political uprisings and things like that. So good programs to manage, but a great learning environment.
How big, roughly, would you say the staff was there?
So local staff is about 400. Okay. U.S. direct hire Americans is about 85 to 90, I think it was. Right. So it's a medium-sized post.
Great. So the kind of issues you faced were something you were preparing for, right?
It was. So there was a huge effort behind earthquake preparedness in Kathmandu. So, essentially, India is pushing Nepal under China. So right. As far as the tectonic plates go, and every 50 years or so, there's a major earthquake. So the last really, really big one was 1934. And so we were overdue and we knew it. So it was a big priority for Post to make sure everyone was prepared to deal with a massive earthquake.
What kind of things were you doing to prepare?
They actually had a really robust program. They had a specific eligible family member position as the earthquake preparedness coordinator. So a lot of the things were modeled off of Los Angeles because Los Angeles has, a couple hundred earthquakes a year of some amount, like smaller, but they're prepared there. So we had one of the things we did was like a neighborhood accountability group. So as far as the residences went, by neighborhood, there was a group of residences that all would coordinate and rally together if there was an earthquake to get accountability quickly. And then the central rally point also had like a lockbox or a nice dumpster, essentially, right, filled with earthquake preparedness kit. So some tents, food, MREs, and some Cliff Bars and things that get people by for a few days nutrition-wise.
Smart.
Potable water, first aid equipment, things like that. The critical needs for the first couple of days after a major event.
So I've seen these in Post before, but how do you keep people kind of appraised of where they are and how to use them?
So every year we did a rally house event. So everybody kind of got together. Usually most of the rally houses would make it kind of a cookout sort of thing, but they would take everything out of the kit. If it was last year's water, then they were putting new water in there, checking the dates on those MREs and the Cliff Bars and things like that, and make sure that everything was still usable. If it wasn't, it was all replaced, and people could eat the MREs that were expired or whatever if they were so inclined. But most people stuck to the burgers and hot dogs type of thing. But so that was one of the programs, and we did practice that and rehearse it every year, so everybody knew where to go and what to do, and that was always done after the big summer transition.
So this is not just an RSO effort.
No, this was a joint effort between RSO and management. So that EFM position fell under management, but there was an ARSO that was assigned that earthquake preparedness portfolio as well, because obviously RSO was going to have a big role in accountability. Right. Both the ARSOs and the local guard mobile units responding to help out where they could. So it was a joint effort. So that was one piece of the preparedness. A second thing we did was a mass casualty event every year.
Smart.
So, everyone participated in that as well. We had large, I call them pop-up tents, but they were bigger than that, So like the tent you take to a ball game or a picnic or a beach or something like that, but they were about 4 times larger. It took a little bit more work to get them put up, but we could essentially cover most of the courtyard with these tents to provide shade. And, there was a monsoon season in Nepal, so we weren't sure if it'd be raining or what the weather conditions would be. So we wanted to make sure we had a large space available to collect injured people there, and how we would get people there, how we would triage those people and prioritize them for transportation to a higher level of medical care.
Right, because in a major crisis, you presume that local hospitals are overwhelmed, so you need to kind of make your own plans.
Yeah, I mean, Nepal's a developing country, so their healthcare system wasn't as robust as what you'd expect in many places. So we knew that would be very quickly overwhelmed, and with the number of staff that's just working at the embassy combined with the number of, if you have 90 Americans, you probably have 300 total American associated with the embassy as far as spouses and children and other members of household, et cetera. So, when you're talking about having a few hundred people and a massive earthquake, then you expect to have, 50 people, I think was a reasonable number of people to expect to have injuries of some, level.
Right. So you had also provided some specialized training to members of the mission?
Yeah, it was a great effort. Came from Ambassador Bodie at the time, that all employees of the mission, and it was extended to eligible family members that wanted to volunteer to participate, actually went to a light search and rescue training that was put on by an earthquake preparedness NGO there in Kathmandu.
Awesome.
So everybody put on hard hats and got a little, nobody was lifting, big things, but they were taught how to communicate with people that may be trapped and how to, what it's critical to get them supplies if it was something we couldn't move them out of, using airbags to move things that were heavier than what people could lift, just manually, and, levers and things like that. And, digging obviously was part of it, but, everyone went through some light search and rescue training to help remove people that would be possible at the, layman level of rescue.
So some of this infrastructure was already in place when you got there, but you integrated, and now you're part of the team.
Right.
You have all this planning and all this preparation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But you said something to me yesterday about all the planning, where it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's a quote from Mike Tyson where he says, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Right.
And
right.
We had a plan. It was practiced and rehearsed. And, the post does crisis management exercises every year or two. Right. And, for Kathmandu, the crisis management exercise was always a massive earthquake, because that was our most, imminent threat.
Most likely, right?
Yeah, most likely threat. And so that's what we planned for. But, not all plans work out 100% the way you hope they will.
So take us to that day. Where was your family and your work situation? What day of the week? How was it for you?
So 9 years have passed, I guess, but it's as clear in my mind as if it happened yesterday. My ex-wife was the CLO, the community liaison officer, and that morning, it was a Saturday, so they had a yard sale event. Essentially, it was getting close. It was April, so it was close to the time where people are going to start the summer transition. Mm-hmm. So basically, Americans that are leaving post, they would have a big yard sale of things that they didn't want to pack out and move back to America or to the next post. And they would offer them at cheap prices, and mostly it was open to the local staff and their families to come in and kind of do some shopping for some American products. So she had left early that morning, and so I was on dad duty, and I was laying on the floor coloring with my daughters. Both of my sons, one was in Oman playing basketball for the interscholastic sports, and my other son was in Mumbai in a track meet. So they were both out of the country.
This is very foreign service of you.
Yeah. But it was also just logistically a hidden blessing that we didn't count on what was going to happen that day. But I was laying on the floor coloring with my daughters, and their mom came home from this yard sale event. It was around noon, and she had just come in, and I kind of sat up on the recliner and said, hey, how'd it go? Did everybody get rid of everything? Our local staff get some good deals, and we're just chatting. And all the residences have an earthquake alarm, which is basically just a little pendulum that hangs on the wall, and a little bit of vibration causes a pretty loud dinging sound.
Okay.
So that earthquake alarm in our house started to go off. I couldn't feel anything in the house at that time, but when it went off, kind of the standard practice was get out of the house. Let's just get outside until...
But you've heard this before.
We had heard it a few times, and I remember the first time I heard it, I had no idea, what is that? Because I hadn't heard this thing before.
Right.
What is that sound? I went out there and realized it was coming from that thing on the wall. I said, let's get outside, But we'd heard it a few times, so we knew, okay, we're going to head outside. So I just My daughters were still coloring on the floor, so I just kind of motioned and said, "Hey, let's get them and go outside."
Yeah.
And I went and said, "Hey, girls, come on, we're gonna go downstairs," because our living room was on the second floor, the weird Kathmandu construction of the houses. But so I picked up my daughters and said, "Hey, we're going to go downstairs." And as I was getting up to walk out of the living room had kind of a wide double door exit that went out into a hallway and then down the stairs. As I was getting to the doorway, the first big shake happened. And later some U.S. GS people told me that this earthquake essentially was like, if you can imagine flattening a beach towel or flattening a blanket for a picnic, kind of that waving motion.
Yeah.
That's the sort of motion that happened under as that plate slipped, that tectonic plate slipped. And that first big wave, I mean, it shook the house enough that, it knocked me off balance, and I just, whoa. So I braced my back against that doorway. And,
Right.
Growing up in America, you hear about earthquakes. You hear, get into a doorway, get into a bathtub, someplace that's going to give you some sort of a TP effect or something that could create a space, if something collapses. You want to be somewhere, and doorways are good for that. Doorways are reinforced. There's twice as much wood around a doorway as in a normal wall. So I stopped there because I thought, wow, if I try to carry the girls down those stairs, which were kind of granite or marble, I'm a pretty big guy. So
Right.
if I fell, carrying them on those stairs, they could be hurt very badly and maybe mortally, right? So I thought, we're better wait it out here for a minute. And then after that first one, as I kind of slid down the door jamb and I pulled their mom down over top of them and was holding on to her, I thought to myself, okay, I'm just going to stay right here. If I see the walls crack, then it's going to be a time that it's worth risking it to get down those stairs. So I thought that it would be over, and because at this point it had been probably 20 seconds, and which is a long time for an earthquake.
Yeah.
But it wasn't letting up, and as it kept getting stronger and stronger. So the house is shaking. I think when that next big ripple, that next big, really big shake came, we had a 10-gallon aquarium we had set up on a little table just out in that hallway. And the aquarium flew off the stand, hit the floor. So now there's water on the floor. There's fish flopping. There was a chandelier in the stairs, and it was like 3 individual globes kind of hanging on separate cables.
Okay.
And they were dancing like somebody was juggling them, And I was just remember looking around, thinking, I'm just watching for the house to crack is what I was looking for. But I saw these things, and I saw those globes finally smash together and glass fly. And I thought, man, this is the one. This is that one that we've been planning for.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much time elapsed. Everything's kind of in slow motion. But I saw the first crack come down the wall, and I told my ex-wife, I said, hey, I want you to get up, get to the stairs, and get a hold of the railing. Keep both hands on the railing and get down the stairs and get the door open. And I'm going to bring the girls. And so I grabbed my daughters, ran forward when there was a moment when it wasn't violent enough that I could move forward a few steps. Got my back braced against the wall and started just kind of riding that wall all the way down the stairs to the bottom, and then ran out the front door. Our car was parked right outside the front door, so I put everybody inside the car and started it and drove it down the driveway, so it was kind of out of where the house couldn't collapse on it and neighboring houses couldn't collapse on it. We had a big yard, but I just felt like they were safer having some protection over them, but as I put them in there, as I got out of the car, it was like visibly bouncing.
Wow.
And I said, hey, girls, it's going to feel like a roller coaster for a few minutes. Everything's fine. You're safe. Nothing can hurt you. I have to go check on our friends, our neighbors. I'll be back.
So you've moved from the upstairs
Yeah.
to the downstairs after watching the lights in the aquarium shatter. You're now in the car. You've moved the car. You're getting out of the car, and it's still shaking.
Yes, 100%. And as I started to leave our little residential compound, our house had a wall around it and a gate at the front. Some neighbors, I didn't even know they knew my name, were saying, Mr. Dan, can we come into your garden? And I said, yeah. And I went and opened my pedestrian gate, and there were several people out in the little alleyway outside my house, and they all ran in and went into my yard, which was big enough to keep people and then, be safe from things falling down around them. And there were some houses you could see bricks falling off of and things around there. So as they were coming in, I ran out and ran to the rally house to make sure everybody else was okay. I felt confident my family was safe, and I wanted to make sure everybody else was okay. So it was about...
when you say you ran to the rally house, you literally ran.
Literally
right? 'Cause
ran.
You didn't drive the car.
No, I didn't drive the car.
Right.
And, everybody in Kathmandu, and I think all of Nepal knew, get out of the houses, because most houses were constructed out of locally made kind of mud bricks. There was, outside of Kathmandu, there are several brick factories where they make these red bricks. And, they're just mortared together, and when everything starts shaking, they're not engineered to withstand that. Right. So a lot of people ran out of the houses. So the street's crowded, and I'm just running through the crowd to get down to the house, it's not maybe 300-400 yards down to the rally house. Okay. So I got there, and the occupant of that house was outside standing in his driveway. And I said, "Hey, have you talked to anybody else?" And he said, "Yeah, the other neighbor is down at Fort Bar. Everybody's accounted for. We're all good." And I said, "Okay, great." And he said they thought maybe the one house had a domestic staff that may have been at the house. So we ran over to that house and just made sure that there was nobody inside that house. And actually, while I was looking around and yelling into the house to see if anybody was there, he got a hold of the people by radio, and they said that their staff wasn't there today. Their staff member wasn't there today. So I ran back home because I knew I had to get to the embassy. I had time to go to work. So I was in a Hakuna Matata t-shirt and a pair of shorts because I was just laying on no shoes on or anything. So
right.
I had to get some clothes on to go to work for what I knew was going to be at least a long day, maybe a long couple of days.
I think barefoot is always the best way to go through broken glass.
Yeah, it was. Didn't think about it at the time. I was lucky not to have any big pieces of glass, but when the adrenaline wore off, I did have sore feet that I had to work through for a couple of days.
You mentioned briefly, this will come up again, the Florida bar. Tell us a little bit about what that is.
Oh, sorry. Forager bar.
Oh, forager.
Fora is Phora. Fora Durbar. It's Nepali words. So it's, sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
Fora Durbar is basically our warehouse compound. It's the GSO logistics warehouse. Okay. And it's also, because it's a large piece of land that was, I think it was gifted to the U.S. government many, many years ago. It's a big compound. So it's also the American Club. There's a big ball field, big enough to play soccer on. They had softball games there. It was the American. There was a pool there.
This is where they were hosting the yard sale event?
Yes. So the yard sale event was there. And unfortunately, for that yard sale event, there was a large, the easiest way is like a big top circus tent was set up already on the ball field for that event. So that came in very handy later on. But that a lot of people were already there because it was a Saturday. So. And that was actually, in hindsight, they said that the number of casualties would have been much higher, but people were not in their homes, especially in the rural areas. It was still a day to go out and do farming or do whatever, and so people aren't inside their houses, on a Saturday at midday. So this all happened at noon. So people were outside, and a lot of Americans were already down at the American Club, so it was very easy to start getting accountability of everyone. So I ran back up to the house. Most of the violent shaking is over at this point. Okay. Actually, I think it was our bodies are probably still shaking more than anything. Right. But when I went up to the house to go in and just grab some basics, I asked my ex-wife. I said, "Hey, what do you need out of the house?" We had a go bag inside, which was our smart. It had a change of clothes for everybody in it. It had some food, some bottles of water, money, copies of credit cards, copies of passports, all the things like if we can't go back into our house. Yeah. If you just grab that bag, you pretty much have everything you need. It was right inside the door. So we did not grab that as planned as we went out the house, but there was a lot on our minds when we went out the door that day. So she had a couple of quick things I wanted to grab. So I ran in, grabbed some clothes, socks, shoes, I ran back out, grabbed that go bag, and gave that to her, and literally ran the 2 miles to the embassy because you couldn't get a car down the road if you wanted to at that point. Yeah. The streets were just filled with people. Yeah. When I got to the embassy, the RSO Steve Shaper he lived just 75 yards or so from the back gate to the embassy. So he was already there. He was in post 1. And he and the Marines were contacting people by radio and getting accountability. And I said, well, I'm going to go set up the alternate command center. We had that set up, a place to do that down at that Fort Bar compound. And our plan was that was where we would collect American citizens who were displaced by the earthquake as well.
Right.
So we needed to get arrangements for that set up as well.
Because that's a huge number of people, right?
Yeah, I mean, Nepal is a big tourist destination, you know, for a lot of different reasons. Culturally, there are a lot of UNESCO heritage sites that people want to go and see, and obviously the Himalayas and trekking, climbing. So yeah, there are a lot of tourists there. So, and we were aware that we would have a big responsibility in that regard as well. So, as I was taking off to start, it was about 3 miles to that compound. I thought, well, it's gonna be a long jog down there, and I'm gonna be sweaty for these clothes for a couple of days. The DCM actually grabbed me and said, "Hey, I need Chris Collins," who was, I think he was relatively junior at that time. I don't remember if it was his first or second tour, but he had the American Citizen Services portfolio for consular affairs. Right. He said, "I need Chris Collins to get back up here. He's down at Fort Bar. Can you get him here?" I said, "Okay, yeah, I can get him." So it dawned on me, well, I can't drive a car, but the LGF had motorcycles, and I'm a motorcycle rider. So I went and grabbed the keys to an LGF motorcycle and a couple of helmets and weaved my way through the people down to Fort Bar. And said, I went through the gate and said, "I need Chris Collins. Somebody run and find Chris Collins for me and bring him here." And he came running over, and I said, "Hop on. I got to get you up to the embassy. Do you have get everything set up to receive the thousands of calls we'd be getting over the next several hours?" So,
speaking of calls, what were communications like at that point?
Well, the cellular system was completely overwhelmed. I mean, obviously everybody's trying to communicate and call and check on people, so you couldn't get a call out on a cell phone at that point at all. Landlines were also overwhelmed. I mean, you know, Nepal doesn't have the same technology even in landlines that we have as far as the capacity of their switches and things like that in the telephone system. So the only communication we had was radios, and we did radio checks weekly there in Kathmandu. So that came in handy that everyone was very familiar, and even family members and children oftentimes were practiced doing that and could use the radio. So that became a critical part of the communication. Text messaging, if you send a text message, sometimes that little packet of information would get through, but it wasn't reliably coming in a time that, you know, you could really respond and rely on that.
Right.
Strangely, one call that did get through, and this was actually right before I ran to the embassy when I was leaving my family, we had, he was working in a locally employed staff position, but he was an American that was just happened to go and visit Nepal and had some family there and decided to stay, got a work visa, and was working at the embassy.
Okay.
He worked for our Population, Refugee, and Migration Office, and he was west of Kathmandu and was going to visit a Tibetan refugee camp, and it was a 3-day walk to that camp from the nearest place you could get to by road. So he's on top of a mountain and just happened to be in a place and had stopped it for a break when he saw the mountains, the landslides first and the dust rolling off the hills before he ever heard a sound or felt anything. And you know, he described that because of the direction and the way that the earthquake happened, he didn't feel a lot of shaking where he was, but he watched the landscape just kind of collapse across in front of him in a panoramic view. Wow. And he understood what was happening. He had a satellite phone with him. So because the satellite phone isn't going up on the same network, he was able to call, and then that call was able to come through to my cell phone. And so my phone rang, which was really strange because I had tried to make a call and couldn't get a call out. My phone rang, and I answered it, and he said, "Oh, thank God, I got through. I've been trying to get through to everybody for about 20 minutes. Can you go check on my fiance, because he lived in an apartment on the north side of the embassy, and he wasn't in the regular residences, right? So all of the U.S. direct hire residences were, as a requirement of the lease, had to meet certain structural engineering standards. But he wasn't a direct hire American, so he lived in an apartment, and we made sure his apartment, as an American, was up to standards and had all the security features that needed to ensure his safety or security. But she wasn't part of our normal accountability list.
Right.
He said, can you please make sure that somebody checks on her and can get her to the embassy? So I said, yes, as soon as we get a guard available that can get up there, we'll make sure we get her. So that was the one phone call I know that got through during that first 24 hours.
You mentioned also the guards. What was the guard response like at the embassy?
It was amazing. I mentioned in the beginning that, it's a great place for an ASO to start because of the competence and the loyalty and the hardworking nature of our Nepali staff. But as I returned back to the embassy with Chris Collins, I realized, it kind of dawned on me that, hey, we have to take care of these guards that are all on duty. And I said, hey, close the service CAC, release some of these guards so they can go check on their families. And as I was doing that and talking to the supervisor about send this person home, close this post, get some of these people out of here. Some guards were running just in their plain clothes. They were in shorts and shirts, kind of like I was, laying around on a Saturday. And they said, what can I do to help? And I said, take that person's belt and take that post.
Off-duty guards were showing.
Off-duty guards. Wow. My family's safe. What can I do to help? Wow. And I said, hey, relieve some of these guys and let them go. So we had our guards. We didn't have many guards in uniform left within an hour. We had guards standing around with a duty belt on, just wearing their everyday clothes of some sort that were covering the post so people could go check on their own families and everything. And we were very fortunate that none of our staff lost immediate family. There were some that had family in rural areas that were caught in landslides and things. Just a small number. I can't remember if it was just one or two of more distant relatives, but we were very fortunate.
There was one other element that was coincidentally at your disposal, or there to help, right? There was somebody at the airport.
Yeah, so strangely, and we weren't even aware of this. I mean, at least at my level of awareness. We actually had a Special Forces, a U.S. Army Special Forces operational detachment that was landing at the airport in a C-130.
This is a dozen people, more or less?
Yeah, okay. Basically a dozen Special Forces soldiers, Green Berets that were arriving to do a joint training exercise with Nepali Special Forces. And talking to them later, they were joking that they thought they were with the worst pilot in the military because the plane was going all over the places they landed, but they literally touched down as the highest intensity part of that earthquake began. Wow. So if you can imagine what that towel being flattened out, imagine being in an airplane on the ground as that's happening. Yeah. So they were thrown around quite a bit on a landing that they thought was just going to be a standard taxiing, So they didn't know if it was a bad pilot or a really bad runway they were landing on there. But they ended up being just another critical asset. They responded straight to the embassy and said, "Hey, nice. What can we do to help?" Which was great. And I don't know. I don't think they had communication with anyone as far as like the Office of Military Cooperation or anything like that. I don't like the defense attaché. They just came and said, "What can we do to help?" We did have 4 Americans that were at the school, at the international school, that were just working on a little project thing on a Saturday. And so we knew the school had supplies, and we knew that people knew that American school would have emergency supplies there. So we did have concerns that people, as a couple hours passed, desperation, people realized my house has collapsed. I don't have a place to stay. I don't have food, water.
Right.
That place has it, and there's nobody there on a Saturday. So people would start climbing over the walls, and different levels of mental states, right? Something really stressful just happened. So we wanted to get those kids back up to the embassy as quickly as possible. So another ASO, Jeff Downing, grabbed a few of those guys and got in a van and slowly made their way down to the school and grabbed those kids and brought them back up to the embassy. So they were helpful there. And then this is several hours. I think it was probably that night that they said, "What else can we do to help?" And because they were planning on doing some time out in the jungle with the Special Forces, they had a couple of cooks that were with the ODA. And they said, "Hey, we've got a couple of cooks here. If you guys have food, we can fire up that kitchen you guys have and start feeding people something other than these Cliff Bars and MREs you have stacked around here." So at that Forward to Bar compound, we have a commissary, so a full grocery store that has American products for things you can't normally get in the Nepali market. So they drove the van down there that night and loaded it up full of just anything that they could put together meals, and they ran the kitchen for the American staff for the next week or so.
Wow.
So
in that first day, like you said, people start to gather, right? So you've got accountability for the employees, but now the employees are probably looking for a way out, and then all these American citizens are looking for help. Yeah. Because their hotels and hostels are collapsed, right? What did that look like?
Well, so as soon as we got accountability of all the Americans, I said, okay, as soon as it's safe, get your go bags, bring as much stuff as you can bring with you that you're going to need to take care of yourself and your family, and come to the embassy. We brought all of our American staff and their families to the embassy. And so I was down at the Fort Durbar compound with one consular officer, and we started bringing American citizens in. So people did show up there. They had been previously put out in warden messages, which are kind of messages to American citizens that sign up, state.step.gov or state /
Safe Traveler Enrollment Program, STEP.
Yes. The STEP program, if they had registered, and they were registered Americans with the embassy, then they received regular messages, and part of those regular messages was, hey, this is the place to go if you ever need, like there's an emergency or there's an earthquake, go to this compound. And so a lot of people knew to go there. So the circus tent was handy because that was already up. A lot of times people scrutinize when the Foreign Service says we have pools as emergency water supply, and they joke that, they just want to have swimming pools.
Right.
But that swimming pool was the water supply that we set up a pump and pumped water into the shower building next to the pool. And that's where hundreds of Americans bathed for the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So the pool was utilized. I found the keys to a forklift and moved a pallet of MREs around to that circus tent. We took a couple of water bubblers from the offices around there that had the big, the water cooler type things. And we set those up at the tent, and we ran a hose over from the way the water supply was set up there from the wells is that it filled these big water tanks first. And then, the water was used out of the tanks, and then the pump essentially just refilled the tanks. Mm. So that system was still working. So we ran a hose over from that, and we would refill those big water bottles. And people respond to stress differently, right? I mean, obviously, everyone went through something really, really terrifying for this earthquake. And, some people, as you mentioned, they were in hostels that were collapsing, and, they got outside, their passports were inside, their bags were inside, and everything's collapsed. Some people didn't have, they were out someplace and just ran over to Fort Durbar. So you had some people who were very, very stressed, and some people who just wanted to help. So, you had a lot of people that volunteered, like, hey, I'll be the water person, and I'll take care of refilling these water bottles. And somebody said, hey, do you have some, can you get some trash bags? And we'll get some trash bags put around, and we'll make sure we're collecting trash. And so some people just volunteered to be helpful that were there as just displaced Americans.
Because you couldn't just immediately call for a fleet of planes to come get everyone.
No, as a matter of fact, the airport, you have regular commercial flights coming in, and some had already landed. So those are taking up, the airport in Kathmandu is pretty small. Yeah. That's their international airport, but it doesn't have gates that you pull up to like a modern full-size airport. The planes just have places to park out there, and then you walk down the stairs, and a tractor pulls up with a trailer. They unload the bags into that and take it into the baggage, to put it on the baggage belts. So it's relatively primitive setup and a very small airport. So with the planes that were already on the ground, we had a C-130 just landed there, and within a couple of hours, India had sent several aircraft to. There's a lot of Indian citizens in Nepal. And the airport got to where there wasn't even room to land a plane anymore because planes were just kind of parked all over the place, and they couldn't even get any more aircraft into there until they got some aircraft out. Yeah. And until we figured out how to get accountability and started getting people organized, not just us, but, there's a whole international effort going on here. We had to get planes out of there, which took some time to get the airport organized in a way that it could be utilized again. So that took a couple of days.
Yeah. So after the first 24, 48 hours, you have some calm, but the crowds are starting to gather.
Yeah.
What are your next steps then?
So it was, that first, I think it was about 36 hours before I left that forwarder bar compound. We had about 300 Americans the first night. By the end of the second day, we had 450 roughly. We had some supplies down there for this, blankets and things like that. People had made, beds out of pallets and things for their families. And we couldn't get people out of there yet. So everybody's just eating MREs. We're getting accountability of everyone. Our consular folks up at the embassy, they had set up a huge call center, which is something they had planned for. Mm-hmm. They brought in all the Peace Corps volunteers that could get back to Kathmandu, and they were helping man the phones and nice. Take calls, because a lot of people are calling into the embassy and saying, "Hey, my son, daughter, husband, wife, aunt, uncle,
right.
friend
people
is
calling
there."
From all over the world.
Right.
Yeah.
So we had to keep a list and keep accountability of everyone we knew where they were. And, yes, we know where they are, or where were they last, or where were they going to be, and trying to coordinate how we would help find those people. So it was busy. We had to, a lot of people, we had to make sure that people could clean themselves. People needed things, diapers, basic medications, like I have a headache, and do you have cold medicine? Do you have this or that? So we took everything out of the commissary and just made kind of a medical supply point and said, we're not allowed to administer any medications here, but here's some medications that are out here if people need something. And as I mentioned before, people react differently to stressful events. So, some people were trying to hoard supplies, and then created arguments between people. Hey, I don't have a blanket for my son, but that person, they have 3 people and they have 7 blankets, and, and tensions are kind of high. So it's easier to keep people, kind of de-escalate things and you have to be the sheriff, and keep some sort of law and order, but do it in a way that's respectful of the fact that people's nerves are raw,
right?
Which is a challenging thing. We would have people show up, to that compound and come to the entrance wanting to come in, but they were clearly intoxicated. So the guards that were working and the consular person was up there getting accountability of Americans was told, if you smell alcohol, to call me, and I would come up there and tell them, hey, you have to go out and sober up. You can't come in here intoxicated. We were, for security purposes, we're screening anything that people brought inside, and we had to have people leave things out like ice climbing axes and things like that. Let's not bring things that could be weapons if people's tensions get high. Right. You have to leave that stuff out. But we weren't, we're looking for things that can be harmful, right? So there were people that were sneaking alcohol inside, and then we'd have to, deal with those kind of problems and things too. Like things that you don't think about having to deal with in that situation. So it was a very busy, but we kept good order down there. And so we got the second day we got, after that first 36 hours or so, we was still just myself, Jeff Downing was the ARSO, Brian Tanner was the ARSOI, and Steve Shaper was the RSO. So it was just the 4 of us trying to kind of manage everything and give each other a little bit of a break to catch a few hours of sleep. The third day, we actually got a flight in from outside, and were able to get some other consular folks in to help, and to get a couple of ARSOs in to help as well. So I think it was the third or fourth day we actually got a full, I think it was 12 hours of sleep that I slept the first time. I got real time to just say, okay, now I can, there's enough people. But the first time I went up to the embassy to get some rest and take a little break and close my eyes for a little while, as I said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Well, all the American citizens were supposed to go to forwarder bar. Mm-hmm. But some people showed up at the embassy, and the ambassador said, we don't want to lose accountability, people. And it's that during that 3 miles, if there's an aftershock and we lose an American, we don't want to risk that. Yeah. So if an American citizen shows up at the embassy, bring them inside. So I was pretty shocked when I first got there in my delirious state, and there's literally tents set up on the lawn of the embassy, and people sitting around in little campfire circles, not fires, but there were things smoking, and it wasn't things that would normally be smoked on government property.
Right.
But I had bigger problems at the time, so I just went inside the embassy and said, oh, I don't know what's happening here.
Barefoot hippies have taken over the compound.
Exactly.
Nice.
And, I'd worked so hard to keep law and order and structure and in my encampment down there that I walked into this place where it was just a free-for-all. As I walked through, past post one of the door, there's a guy walking toward me in a pair of boxer shorts, barefoot, no short, just walking to the restroom. What is happening? What is happening here? People sleeping under the stairs and around the floor in the atrium.
Wow.
I don't know what's happening here. I went and checked in with my kids and my ex-wife and said, "Hey, you guys doing okay?" And they were sleeping in the Clo office, and I said, "I'm going to go upstairs to the RSO suite and sleep for a few hours and kind of try to clear the fog out of my brain for a few hours before I go back down." But it was a pretty wild first 2 days.
And so help starts to roll in. You got agents, you got consular officers. Other offices, other law enforcement agencies sent people, right?
So actually, it wasn't law enforcement officers, but we did have USA 1 and USA 2. So there are 2 international search and rescue teams in America. One is Fairfax, Virginia. The other one's Los Angeles, California. It's amazing. These teams are made up of... and I think many of them are volunteers, but there's physicians, paramedics, structural engineers, and firefighters that make up these teams, and they train together regularly. And I think they're funded by USAID's Humanitarian Assistance, Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. And because of the airport situation and just the government bureaucracy of getting everything approved, it took 3 days, I think, for them to get on the ground.
Okay.
But what an amazing thing was when I first went back down that they were arriving and these trucks rolled into the Fort Bar compound and they said, "Hey, we need a couple of forklifts is what we need." And I said, we had GSO local staff there at that time. And I said, "This guy will help you out with whatever you need." And it was just amazing to watch these guys build a city. They said, what space can we have? And you said, "You can have all that space there." And they built a city of these hard wall tents essentially, but they were nice buildings, generators, light towers, their own command center, and they were set up and ready to go out and start search and rescue efforts throughout Kathmandu, which was really neat thing to see. As they were, Jeff Downing, the other ARSO, came down with his son, Colin, who was, I think he was around 10 at that time. And I mountain biked with them, with my sons quite a bit, but they did a lot of mountain bike riding around the city and around the areas around Kathmandu. And in Nepal, there are no addresses, not like street addresses that make any sense. My residence was called Dumbarai House because and people, you say, "Oh, that house, yeah, I know where that is." So you go down to this street, past this, turn here, and they just kind of give directions to places. So as they were saying, "Hey, we know there's a person trapped in this place. Well, how do we get those American search and rescue teams to this location?" Right. So we have an FS&I, one of our RSO local staff investigators that's there trying to help out and give directions, but just the language barrier and what seems like the way that the FS&I is describing how to get to some place is natural and makes sense to him, but it didn't make sense to anyone else. So Colin said, "Oh, I know where that place is." This 10-year-old, and he kind of steps up and said, "Oh, you just go here and here," and he kind of map tracked it for them and told them how to get to these places. So they had hired trucks and local drivers, and they'd say, give them directions, and so the guys had maps and they knew exactly how to get to the places. So it was really cool to see, one of the kids, because of their familiarization with the city, was able to really help, get the resources where they were needed, which was something you could have never planned for.
And then you said early on that your own kids, 2 of your kids were in other countries at the time.
Yeah.
How was that for you to link up with them?
So because we couldn't get calls out right away, when I did have time, I shot an email down to the RSO shops in those respective countries and said, "Hey, my kids are there. Can you just let them know we're okay?" And as far as that goes, anybody that's usually when the kids travel, they stay with a host family, and it's other American diplomats at those posts. So can you just put a note out to all the host families that all Americans are accounted for, that everybody's okay, and just let everybody know. So it took I think they came back 5 days later, so they had a little extended stay for their sporting trips. But we were able to get word to them that everybody was okay in Kathmandu and all the Americans were accounted for. Which the word did get to them, and they were relieved, and they just continued having fun where they were at, and didn't have a care in the world about it because we said everything's okay.
So they came back, but the next kind of order of business was to put the post on departure status, right?
Yeah. So because we were having regular aftershocks, I think the first one was just a couple days later. It was like a 6.7. There was one after we got all the American family members on order departure out of the country. We had one that I think was like 7.4 or 7.6.
Wow.
Another.
What was the big ones on the day out?
So the big one was depending. Initially, they said 7.9. I think the USGS settled on 7.8 as the final official magnitude. China's geological survey said it was 8.1.
Wow.
So and as far as those kind of when we talk about the Richter scale, every whole number is a 10 times multiplier. So you consider something that's an 8, that's 100 times stronger than a 6.
Yeah.
So it's significant.
Wow.
So I think in Virginia there was a kind of a weird earthquake that was a 4.8 or a 5.1 a couple years ago. So imagine 1,000 times stronger than a 5.1 or a 4.8
Wow.
is what we experienced in Kathmandu. So obviously that damaged a lot of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which is, I think, some indication. Those places have been around for centuries and survived several large earthquakes. Yeah. So this one, not just because of the magnitude, but because of that type of earthquake or the type of seismic activity that rippling effect caused a lot more damage, a lot more landslides, and a lot more catastrophe than past large Richter scale type earthquakes did.
Okay. So you were, again, your family was getting reunified basically just in time to leave. Right?
Yes. Yeah. We got everybody together, and then they were shipping out, which, obviously you worry about your family. You don't like being away from them. But from an operational standpoint, it was just one less concern as those aftershocks were happening, things of, where are they at? Where are they going to, what are they going to be able to eat? Can we go back to our house? Because at that point we hadn't cleared the residences and things. So it was just one stressor off everyone's plate that had to stay behind and had work to do through the recovery and then the transition into more of a humanitarian assistance role.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So again, the first few days, let's call it maybe, 5 days, 6 days is rescue and recovery. And then what was the next phase like?
Well, the next phase was, there were two parts. One is, how do we return to normalcy? Like are residences suitable for people to go back to? Are the bridges in the city, can people drive on the roads? Because there are bridges, there's rivers around Kathmandu. Can people drive across those bridges? Is the school safe to send kids back to? So we have to start planning for, if and when we can bring people back and it's safe to do that. And at the same time, obviously America and a lot of international efforts put into humanitarian assistance for the whole country of Nepal, which was, it wasn't the entire nation that's affected, but, from northwest of Kathmandu, there's basically a big rectangle, if you can imagine, probably, 100 miles wide and 200 miles long that was significantly damaged by this earthquake. So, there's although it wasn't initially our aim was to get supplies, some temporary sort of structures out to them and food and potable water and things like that out to the rural areas and villages that were affected. But, part of that ended up being also bringing seriously injured people back into Kathmandu to a higher level of medical care.
Sure.
The medical system was overwhelmed in Kathmandu. There were, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,000 deaths, 22,000 injuries. So, that would overwhelm any city's hospitals pretty quickly. But so there was a transition. The Marines came in. I think maybe on the third day, a command element of the Marines came in in preparation for a non-combatant evacuation operation.
This is getting out all the American citizens that were not part of the embassy.
Correct. Yeah. Let's get the Americans out of there was their initial intent. But once they got the airport kind of moving again and the aftershocks weren't serious enough that would preclude flights, then we were able to start getting commercial, initially chartered flights, and then regular commercial flights started coming in. Less frequent than normal, obviously, but we were able to get flights in and out of there. So the Marine role shifted from that NEO status to a humanitarian assistance role. So we had the Marines had a command station at Forward Bar above the gym. They had taken the second floor where they had to kind of overwatch, because where our tents were in a real emergency would have been the place we would have removed the tents, moved people out of the way and started bringing Marine aircraft into that place to land them to take people out. And but ended up being something that we didn't have to do. Over the next couple of days, we did erect 2 more of those circus tents. So we ended up with 3 tents on the ball field, and then plus the search and rescue city that was built there. So it ended up being a pretty big operation down there. And Canadian citizens, actually, we made a bilateral agreement with them that we would bring in the Canadian citizens into our compound and take care of them. And since they couldn't fill a full plane when the Canadians did send in a charter flight, that was filled with Americans that needed passage out. Nice. So ended up being a good trade-off for assistance there. But we did eventually start getting everyone out. The most difficult thing was there were some people that were Nepali American dual citizens, and they didn't want to leave. They had a pretty good situation there. They were getting food and water, and they didn't have a home to go to.
Right. So
there were some people that stayed there as much as a couple of weeks, and we had to figure out how to passionately evict them. Essentially toward the end of that. Right. But so yeah, I think the next big piece is talking about that humanitarian assistance and the role the Marines played there. When they brought in their aircraft, they brought in several helicopters, and they were flying routine supply, deliveries out into the rural areas. And Nepalis were flying as well. And I think it was May 12th, which was about a little over 2 weeks after the initial earthquake. The Marines were flying, they flew to a rural village, and they were flying out. And it was late in the day, and I think they were delayed on the ground a little bit because there were several injured people, and the Marines were trying to kind of triage who they could only bring a couple of people on the aircraft because there were 6 Marines and 2 Nepali Special Forces soldiers on each of those Hueys. So they couldn't take back any more weight than just a few extra people. And as they were flying out, once the afternoon heat starts, the wind convection gets really, really strong over top of the mountains, and it was something that they didn't account for or were kind of caught off guard by. And as they came out of this valley and the helicopter caught that wind, it slammed the helicopter and back into the mountain. And we lost all 6 Marines and those 2 Nepali soldiers in a helicopter crash. So that was up to that point, we were really lucky, and we've been fortunate with how everything had worked out. And even though our plans didn't work perfectly, we had prepared for everything we'd prepared for worked in some manner. And that was just something we couldn't have, expected. And, obviously those were professionals that knew what they were doing. And, they risked them. I think they probably knew they were risking themselves to try to help that village. And so that was a tragic thing that happened.
And the recovery effort for that crash had some challenges of its own.
It did. They flew a team of Air Force PJs, pararescuemen, out there to recover the Marines, to recover everyone that was involved in that crash, and to recover sensitive equipment from the aircraft itself. Sure. Which they actually had to get dropped off on the top of the mountain and fast rappel down to where the crash site was, and hoist everything up back to the top of the mountain where they could get picked up again. Because down you're talking about several thousand feet. There was no way for them to get down, and there was no passage down. So the only thing to do is to hoist everything up, and they roped everything back up to the top and recovered everyone that way, which was impressive professionals there as well, to hear them account of how they, the efforts they had to put into that recovery. Then we had to deal with, obviously there's Nepali military folks involved in our Marines. So the Nepali military wanted the remains brought to their facility. And initially the Marine commander conceded, and he said, well, I'm going to have a Marine that's posted there full time at this place on this military base. And the Nepalis agreed, and so Jeff and I were along for that transport and to go over there, and we were kind of liaisoning at that point with the Nepali military because we knew that there would have to be some forensic involvement for identification of our Marines.
Because initially you couldn't, the damage was so severe that you couldn't.
Yes, no one was identifiable. We did have some folks, medical folks, that were down at the airport when they came back to try to make some identification, but it wasn't possible. So when we got to the Nepali military base, they had basically a brick structure with about a 3 foot by 3 foot cube of ice sitting in the middle of the room, and some stainless steel tables set up to put the
remains,
the body bags on.
Yeah.
And when the Marine commander saw it, he lost it and said, my Marines are not staying here. And he was very upset. So we asked the Marines, hey, take him aside for a minute. And Jeff and I talked to the Nepali commander and said, listen, strangely, as a fun fact, U.S. Embassy Kathmandu is the only embassy in the world that has its own morgue. And because there are so many people who go to do high-risk recreation there, mountain climbing and trekking in the Himalayas, we oftentimes, or not oftentimes, but it occurred frequently enough that there were American remains that need to be repatriated, that the embassy bought a morgue years ago and had a cooler set up that was, a designed commercial body storage unit. So he said, we have an actual professional commercial morgue at the embassy at the Forward Bar compound. And, your soldiers are part of this as well. This is a much better place to take them. We'll give 3 of your Special Forces soldiers identification badges. They can come and go freely from the Forward Bar compound. They can stay posted there with a Marine where their remains are being kept. Can you at least come and look at our facility first, and then let's talk about this? And they agreed to do that. And then when we got there, they agreed it was a much better arrangement for the preservation of their soldiers. And ultimately they wanted their soldiers' remains to be identified as well.
Sure.
So we needed to make sure that somewhere was going to preserve them, and which was going to take some time, because we were going to send samples back to America, to the FBI, to do that forensic identification. So we did. We brought them back to the Forward Bar compound, and they posted a Nepali Special Forces soldier. At this point, the search and rescue team had kind of vacated those hard wall tents, so we gave them one of those buildings that had cots, sleeping bags in it, and labeled it as Nepali Special Forces, and they kind of had their own setup there. So, and they were comfortable with that situation, and that was a successful negotiation of that, which once again, the very volatile, emotional situation for the commanders on both sides. So I'm glad that all ended up working out.
Well, looking back, like you said, it's been about almost 10 years now.
Yeah.
What would you say were your biggest lessons learned, and maybe what advice would you give to fellow agents heading out to an environment like that?
If you're at a post where we can prepare, our training that we go through, whether it's our Atlas for high threat posts or basic special agent training, we can prepare for things that go bang and things that go boom, and emotionally disturbed people. We can prepare and train for all those things, and we know how to run towards that and mitigate that threat. But when Mother Nature decides that she's going to unleash her wrath, you're completely helpless. So you had better have planned and prepared for everything that you can. And if you're at a post where a natural disaster is a potential, then you've got to manage up and get posts to take it seriously and prepare for it. And although plans do fall apart, if you have enough plans in place that and it's well practiced, it'll all still work out. You can adjust and flex where you need to and make everything work. But that preparedness is absolutely critical. And I carried that with me to Fiji, where we have 6 cyclones a year, and it was kind of like, well, when they happen, we put up storm shelters over our windows. We do this. And I said, well, but what is the plan? So because of my experience in Nepal, I really pushed, and I had a charge that was an awesome guy, Mike Goldman, he said, hey, I like this. Let's do it. And a management that was on board to really amp up the preparedness there. So, I think that's the number one lesson is be prepared and know that when something bad happens, there's a lot of work to do. So the more things you've already thought through and have a plan for, that'll make that first 48 hours of sleepless time work a lot better.
Dan, I can't thank you enough. That is an incredible story, man.
Yeah.
I'm glad we had the right people there at the right time.
Yeah, I give all the credit to to the management, to Ambassador Bodie, to the RSO, the whole RSO team, and an incredible local staff that really stepped up when it was needed. So I don't wish the experience on anyone. Still, if I'm in a place where a lot of times when you're in an airport, you'll feel like when an airplane lands and the ground shakes a little bit, it still gives me a little jump, even close to 10 years later. So, but all in all, it was as good as it could have been, I think, as far as a bad situation goes.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Well, it's great again seeing you, and I look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to share my story.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.